Hello and welcome to all our young Padawans out there. I'm Joe, here with me is my co-host Dan.
Hello and greetings.
And this video is going to be about how Episode 1 is the most underrated Star Wars movie, and the second best, as the title says. We could have been much more obnoxious about the title, but we decided we had to be nice. The movie starts with basically the Jedi arriving at the Trade Federation base, Qui-Gon not listening to Obi-Wan, going, I have a bad feeling about this. There's something off about this entire mission. And elsewhere, there's an elusive threat here. A phantom menace, you might say. And Qui-Gon goes, phooey, what do you know? Only for Obi-Wan to be proven right from across all these movies. The end. I'm joking. But meanwhile, the Naboo are busy cursing themselves because they're stupid. What? I'm just saying they should have militarized. And they're saying, you have Padme. We're not going to condone war or militarizing right now. Instead, we'll agree to be conquered, tortured, and slaughtered until we can talk some sense into these people. What? Just a Naboo strategy of just not militarizing right now is just... Because so long as Rome was only safe because of the Roman legions. The minute the legions were gone, no one could... The empire ceased to be. That's just the basic rules of civics and history. You need your Roman legions. And the thing is, when the Republic dissolved its military 1,000 years before, this is part of the lore of these movies, they messed up. And the Jedi dissolved their private military, so sort of. It's more like they had their own military alongside the Republic. They should never have dissolved it, because that was the only protection the Jedi ever had from the Republic. Considering the Republic's massacred the Jedi a few times and dissolved the Order a few times in the expanded universe lore. So everybody's dumb for not having an army here. Because if they had an army, the Trade Federation could not just run roughshod over the Republic. So there's a lot of lessons to be had here. What is more is that we then get into how the Jedi just cut their way through the Trade Federation base. Obi and Qui-Gon just do such a great job. They're probably the best team in the galaxy, so no surprise there. Only the team up or the combo of Celia and Obi-Wan are better than Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan. So let's just acknowledge that this is the second best team, actually. Jar Jar shows up. Yeah, there's some controversy today. Back in the day, 20 years ago, there was no controversy surrounding Jar Jar Binks. But it's something that was cooked up over time by people. I don't know why. But, he's actually funny. Now, we haven't watched these movies in years. But Jar Jar is hilarious. He's a riot. The ability to speak does not make you intelligent. Oh, I love that line. Liam Neeson is great in this movie. Now, Jar Jar agrees to take them to Otoh-Gunga, the hidden city of the Gungans, whereupon they're introduced to, Boss Nass, who gets mind-tricked up the wazoo. Jeez. Qui-Gon, you're overdoing it. But we are introduced to the life debt of the Gungans, which is similar to the Wookiee life debt, which, okay, but there are cultural differences to be sure, but we're not going to deal with that in this video. We then get through the underwater scenes with Gojira showing up, because there's always a bigger fish. The thing about this movie is that it's great, and almost every line has become basically a meme or a popular idiom in our culture for a reason, because it's that good. And in that regard, the prequels, just about every line in the prequels has become like that. We get the invasion of Naboo, which, there's no response on the part of Amidala. She's like, well, I guess we'll just roll over. Which is just, it's such a disaster. which that's how you describe Padme's entire political career. Just disaster after disaster. She basically fails upwards, which is politics in a nutshell. Not to mention Hollywood in a nutshell. The thing is, though, the Jedi come to the rescue, because of course they do. They're the cleanup guys of the galaxy. Sinestro thought he had it bad as a Green Lantern. Imagine if he was a Jedi. That would have driven him even more bonkers.
He would have probably had a brain aneurysm so bad at birth, and he would have died from brain blood loss.
Yeah, oh, yeah, from blood flooding his brain. Yeah, because just the stuff the Jedi put up with. And I have to clean up after. But in a scene where Sabe says, well, let's... I don't know about this whole thing with rushing off planet, and then turns to Padme, and you have Padme. We are brave, Your Highness, which is code for just do it. And you can see that Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan are just looking from Padme to Sabe, kind of like, seriously? This is... like, you can't even properly hide the fact that Padme is the leader? Come on, man.
You have to teach Sabe some leadership techniques, so that way...
Well, Sabe is a better leader than Padme, but it's just...
She can't always be deferring to her handmaiden.
But here's the thing. Sabe is just a bodyguard. And, like you said, just publicly deferring to Padme, to the handmaiden, is just such... It makes it so obvious. And, yeah, on your first viewing, you might not see that, but we've seen these movies so often. I think we know it line by line, both of us. Like, you then got the journey to Tatooine. Now, there's some controversy by some people who hate this movie that Tatooine is actually further from Coruscant, from Naboo, but that's actually... No, that's a blatant lie. If you actually bring up a map of the Mid-Rim and the Outer Rim, you'll see that Naboo is actually closer to Tatooine, but it just depends on the angle of the map, because you're not dealing with... Like, in a 2D map, it's almost directly in between the two. But the trouble is, now the Mid-Rim is almost the vastest part of the galaxy, but the thing is, if you look at a 3D map, it would probably... No, it would definitely be closer to Tatooine. So, in that regard, Lucas holds true. It's just, we don't have 3D maps. At least we don't have access to them like us common folk. Because if you go to a space station or something, they certainly have access to that kind of technology. But we don't. That said, the thing is, Qui-Gon, when he goes to leave the ship on Tatooine, forbids any transmissions off planet because he knows the Trade Federation are going to be searching for those. Padme and Panaka insist that Padme go with Qui-Gon, who's just like, this is not a good idea. He knows she's the queen, and he's just going, seriously, we're going to risk the 14-year-old ruler of Naboo falling into sexual slavery. Yeah, this is not a good idea. That said, there's a humorous scene after Anakin is introduced, wherein Qui-Gon tries mind tricks on Watto, only for it to be revealed Toydarians are resilient to mind tricks, and it doesn't really work on them. So Qui-Gon's frustrated and storms off, and then we find out after they end up, well, Jar Jar is rescued by Anakin from Sebulba. They then go to Annie's place, where he lives with his mom, Shmi, and we are introduced to the fact that the slaves have nanite bombs placed inside their body, so that if they try to get off planet, they'll blow up. Which is horrifying to think about. Just horrifying. That basically robs you of any and all freedom of choice in life. That's scary. And then we get the scene, no one can kill a Jedi, and you have Qui-Gon. I wish. He's referring to Tal from the Jedi Apprentice series there in universe. And Qui-Gon later has the humorous scene where he says, listen, we'll have to agree to Annie's plan to risk, the ship on a pod race, and you have Padme going, I don't approve. You have Qui-Gon more like, well, I don't care, and you have her, well, not in so many words, but like you have her. The queen will not. You have Qui-Gon who interrupts and says, "The queen trusts my judgment. You should too, and she doesn't need to know." Well, actually, no. He says the queen doesn't need to know, and Padme just pouts. And later at the pod race, she just goes, you're too impulsive. You're risking too much. And you have Qui-Gon. The queen trusts my judgment. You should too. He's just in that scene. He's looking her right in her face, in the eye, and with his eyes, he's communicating, "I know." And Padme still doesn't clue in. The thing about Padme is she is not very, very smart. She is incredibly dumb. But that is her character. George is deliberately establishing her character as being someone who has a lot of beauty later in life when she's full grown. A lot of charm. She does have some charisma. But the trouble is she's very, very, very... She's got the... Okay, Homer Simpson is smarter than her. That's the problem with her character. Padme is one of the dumbest people in the galaxy. And she's elected based on her looks, which does sometimes happen in real life, and it has historically happened. Some have been able to brilliantly use their good looks, such as Augustus. Some haven't. Padme is someone who mismanages her entire political career and is under the political protection of Palpatine, so that she's always hitched to his wagon. So, she goes far because of her looks and because of Palpatine. That said, the pod race is very obviously stated from the beginning to essentially be rigged by Watto, who says that Sebulba never loses, and Qui-Gon still decides to hedge his bets, feeling that through the Force that this time it'll be different. That said, we get blue versus red on the die, and this is where we get blue as the color of truth and royalty, and it's a sea-based color, so there's also hints of tempestuousness. So we get a bit of a insight into Anakin there. Anakin is very truthful right now. Truth means a lot to him, but it later gets clouded because, well, that story of his life. And the thing about Anakin is he's tempestuous by nature. He has a temper. As for Shmi, the red, I think, refers to her previous life, wherein she was a certain kind of slave, but she did not have a man when she kind of conceived Anakin. So that plays a huge role in why Qui-Gon wants to free Anakin. He tries to free both, doesn't succeed, so he tries to salvage what he can from the situation, because he almost does not get the bet at all. But he rigs the dice with the Force, and we also find out after the race, the race is just glorious to watch. Our dad loved that race and always had to watch it when he watched these movies. It's such a great scene. Such a great scene. But we find out that all must abide by their bets and their debts. That's the law, one law of Jabba the Hutt. So Watto will not fight Qui-Gon. Qui-Gon says, all right, I'll go to court. Now, Jabba hates Jedi, but how much you want to bet he's going to take my side when I tell him you're trying to break your side of the bet? And Watto cracks and says, fine, take him. Fearing Jabba too much. Unaware that Qui-Gon was bluffing. Qui-Gon has no intention of staying long enough to go to court or deal with Jabba the Hutt. Qui-Gon's not dumb enough to deal with Jabba the Hutt. He fears Jabba. Rightfully so. He knows Jabba's too dangerous for him to take on. Now, for a Luke Skywalker, that's not really the case. But Luke is a very special Force sensitive. And some like Kyle and Django don't fear Jabba because, well, they're cool. They have the rule of cool. They don't have to worry about Jabba. Qui-Gon does not have that kind of authorial protection. Or fan protection by virtue of being cool. So, well, Qui-Gon is cool, but he doesn't have any protection whatsoever on that front. We get the touching and heartbreaking scene of Shmi and Anakin's separation, which is just gut-wrenching. This is a horrifying scene. If we were doing our shot-for-shot analysis thing that we were doing with the Power Rangers movie over on the Power Ranger Corner. This would be a long video wherein we analyze mother archetypes, sons, and the importance of parental and child bonds, but we're just skimming through, so we're not going to do that. And we're not going to do any shot-for-shot analysis of these movies. Let's see. We get the desert duel between Qui-Gon and Maul, which is pretty one-sided. Qui-Gon's easily exhausted because, well, he's old. Maul isn't. So, yeah. Maul's not even trying. He's only got one side of his lightsaber activated. We then get the fateful and destined introduction of Obi and Anakin, which we can already tell that Obi-Wan does not like the kid. Obi-Wan's not a child person. Now, later authors, post-2005 and 6, try to make him out to be a child-loving guy, but he's not. He doesn't like kids. He doesn't. It's that whole, have we picked up another pathetic life form line. That said, when Obi-Wan gets attached to young boys, he tends to be quite fond of them, as shown in The Secrets of the Jedi. The trouble is, it takes him a while. It's just Obi-Wan's not always a people person. We get... Oh. Yeah. Anyways. We got the gang traveling to Coruscant, which Coruscant's a great location. I love that city planet. We have Palpatine who manipulates Amidala against Valorum, and this is a sad, tragic scene because he's using her youth and inexperience against her so that he could create a crisis to seize power. Now, the tax law that he tried to pass is one which would be taxing trade routes along hyperspace lanes and when you're transporting goods. This actually hits the little guy really hard. But the thing is, it's being applied also to the major corporations, but harder on smaller ones. This is a very bad law. It's a very bad idea. It's like the King's Road taxes of some of the Middle Ages kingdoms. You tax a road, you have a road tax, it hurts everyone. But the problem is that the Trade Federation are initially, when they wanted to mount a protest against this, that was a good idea. Problem is, they then decided that, why do a protest when you could just do a military takeover of a region in protest? Because no one can fight you because they don't have an army and you do. Now, the corporations are allowed an army, but the Republic and the Jedi are not allowed an army. This is so dumb. But this is how the society has progressed, because they're so traumatized from 1,000 years ago's war that, That said, Padme agrees to cooperate with Palpatine because there's another mistake that the Republic has made over the years. They've allowed the corporations to have representatives in the Senate, direct representatives, and have a voice in government.
That never ends well.
Yeah, which is a terrible idea here. And there are no monopoly laws or trust fund laws in the Republic. So already the Republic is just shooting itself in the foot. And this creates havoc within the Senate till Padme, who always does politically what the last person who whispered into her ear says, which is scary because look at the War of the Roses. It was Henry VI. Henry VI would just listen to the advice of the last person. And that just ended so badly. That wrecked England for a while. So Padme is basically tossing a nuke into the Senate hall. Within hours, possibly days, Palpatine already has his political faction organized to elect him Chancellor. Now he's the leading contender within such a short amount of time. There's a reason the Jedi were suspicious of him over that. They were just kind of looking at him and going, that was fast, dude. What the heck? Mace Windu was one of the most suspicious, going, that's not normal.
We need to investigate this.
Now, the Jedi didn't because crisis after crisis. Padme, though, never gave it much thought until episode 3 because she's not very bright. Let's just admit it. But that's her character. The Jedi during the council with Anakin, meanwhile, seem to turn to Mace Windu for leadership, which is pretty interesting. But he's Sam Jackson. Of course they're going to turn to him. This is Sam Jackson in his prime. Like, of course you're going to turn to him for leadership. I'm joking. That said, Anakin is turned down for Jedi status because he has too much anger and fear in him, and the Jedi use the excuse that he's too old. While he's glaring daggers at the Jedi Council, which is, wow, if looks could kill, every Jedi would be dead. Which, a kid looks at you with those kind of eyes, yeah, no. I'm not training him to be a Jedi, But Jake Lloyd did a great job as Anakin in this movie, it has to be said. Because that look. That said, Qui-Gon decides to humiliate Obi-Wan and drop him like used baggage. And basically gives him backhanded compliments which sound more like insults. Which are basically insults once you think about the actual meaning of the words. And Obi-Wan is naturally enraged, but hides it better than Qui-Gon hides his bitterness at Anakin being turned down. And Obi-Wan and him later have a heated argument, because of course they do. And they're arguing incessantly at this point in the movie, because Obi-Wan's just saying, I have a bad feeling about that kid. Qui-Gon's not listening. And watch the rest of the Star Wars movies for why you should have listened to Obi-Wan. And why Obi-Wan rocks. But we then get the midichlorian thing. Okay, so some people have an issue with this, but this is... Okay, the idea here is, you got to bear in mind, George Lucas was an incredibly intelligent man. He is an incredibly intelligent man. He's a genius IQ guy. Watch these movies and read the Star Wars novels, which are the original adaptations. The movies are adaptations of novels. The novels follow his story outlines and scripts. So the thing is, Lucas is a genius. He understands anthropology, history, civics. He's an expert in these fields, from what I can tell. He studied psychology under Joseph Campbell, who was a student himself, a direct student of Carl Jung. Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell were two of the most brilliant men of the 20th century. And the thing about Lucas is that he's an expert in so many fields. Let's just be honest. He's a genius IQ guy. So what he's looking at when it comes to the midichlorians is essentially metaphysics. The idea of metaphysics is, let's say you are born French, you have a distinct energy, spiritual energy of sorts, sort of. This is basically, it's not exactly this, but this is in layman's terms. If you're French, let's say, you have a distinct energy that separates you from the English. Just as there's a specialness to being English, just as there's a specialness to being Scottish or German. And there's certain distinctive characteristics that every person who is French, English, Japanese, or whatever have that separates them from others. And that marks them out very, very specifically. And that makes you different from certain other people. And that is kind of the idea of the midichlorians. It is the genetic pattern of the Force. The Force itself is essentially a large metaphysical energy source used by these special individuals in Star Wars. That's, by and large, what it is. So now I understand if you don't understand it, and that's fine. But you can't say it's a stupid concept. It's actually a brilliant concept. And it makes a lot of sense. So, yeah. Don't call it stupid if you don't understand it. It's just George is thinking on a higher plane. You'd need only think about the fact that in England and France, they had 1,000-page books 100 years ago all about the metaphysics of England and France and their people. So, and if you're American, just know you'd probably be metaphysically considered the equivalent of the Irish or the English, considering most of you are descended from them. And your culture is more like theirs. So basically, you have to go back to the root country for this sort of stuff. It's very fascinating. And I'd love to read more about metaphysical theories, especially regarding the Japanese, Koreans, French, and English, and even the Irish. I'd love to read more about it. And about the Norse, because I want to know what causes Vikings to come out. I'm kidding. Anyways, Padme decides that she's going to use the Gungans as a distraction because the thing is about this plan is that it's basically a racial supremacy plan, sort of. If the Gungans are wiped out by the droid army, then the Naboo will have dominance over Naboo, the planet, I mean. But if the Gungans wipe out the droid army, then the Naboo are liberated. So essentially win-win for the Naboo people. Boss Nass walks into this trap, but ultimately, given that he later outlives Padme and the Gungan people don't really suffer under the thrall of the Empire and live out pretty freely during the Imperial period, whereas Naboo suffer under the thrall of the Empire, Boss Nass has the last laugh, long-term wise, so that's pretty funny. Now, I'm not suggesting Padme is deliberately cruel, but she's kind of inadvertently cruel there. Padme does not care to warn the Gungans about this, but Qui-Gon is very visible, and Panaka as well, are very visibly distressed, as is Obi-Wan, at her plan, thinking it impulsive, and trying to warn Boss Nass, this might not be a good idea to use your army as a diversion. Boss Nass doesn't listen. As to Padme's revelation to Boss Nass, Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon are visibly unsurprised. So they actually share an almost amused, knowing look. Also, they reconcile before the battle, and then we get the glorious battles, which is... The space battle is pretty fun. It's pretty straightforward. It's not as glorious as, say, Episode 4's Death Star battle, which is a lot more glorious. I'll even say the Hoth battle was a little funner to watch.
Which, that is impressive, considering how more modernized special effects you'd expect the more modern...
But the best space battle scene is obviously in Episode 3 with the Battle of Coruscant. That battle is just incredible. That said, you then get the battle between the Gungans and the droids, which is hilarious because Jar Jar, he's just always such a riot. I love Jar Jar Binks. I love him. He's such a great character. I wish he got a bit more screen time in Episodes 2 and 3, but people apparently had issues later on, so... whatever. As to the Jedi versus Sith battle, everyone's already dissected this battle, and if we were doing a shot-for-shot analysis, we'd analyze this into the ground, but we're not going to. Needless to say, Qui-Gon's easily overwhelmed during the fight because he's old. Obi-Wan's still feeling great and pumped because he's young. Maul is Maul. That said, Obi-Wan gets angry when Qui-Gon is introduced rather rudely and abruptly to the blade end of Maul's lightsaber. Obi slices the lightsaber in half in a fit of rage, then is kicked into the pit. Alright, kids, time for that How I Met Your Mother thing. The only person who can throw you into your pit is you. And the only person who can get you out of it is you. That's basically what the pit is. It's a metaphor for Obi-Wan tossing himself into that pit. No, it is. And, of course, Obi-Wan pulls himself out through the lessons of his daddy dearest and destroys his shadow self, because Obi-Wan is the warrior archetype in this film, Qui-Gon is the magician archetype, and Maul is the sadist shadow warrior archetype. So the sadist is the shadow archetype of the warrior, is what I mean there. Obi-Wan kills Maul, and I don't care what anyone says, there's no way Maul could have survived a 30-foot or 60-foot drop and being sliced in half. So the revival story makes no sense. And if you're going to hate me, whatever. It's the internet. Difference of opinions. Deal with it. And then we get Obi-Wan refusing to back down from the council, who plead with him not to train Anakin. He doesn't listen because Qui-Gon emotionally blackmailed him with his last words. Which, this is probably the cruelest... Nah, the second cruelest thing Qui-Gon's ever done to Obi-Wan. The cruelest thing Qui-Gon ever did to Obi-Wan was in the Secrets of the Jedi book. But we're not going to discuss that. But just in the movies, this is cruel beyond words, because this is emotional blackmail. I'm not saying Qui-Gon Jinn's a cruel person. He's actually a really good person, even a great guy, someone I'd love to go out for drinks with if I knew him in real life. But I would not want to be his kid. He's a little absent-minded with his kid in terms of how he treats him. He sometimes forgets to treat... He takes Obi-Wan for granted, which that's the story of Obi-Wan's life. Everyone, except for Silly Tachi, takes him for granted. and maybe Mace Windu. Mace Windu doesn't take him for granted. So you have Yoda, you have Qui-Gon, you have Anakin. They always put Obi-Wan in the middle. They always take him for granted. And it's incredible that Obi-Wan is able to negotiate and compromise his way through these relationships. Now, it cost him a lot, but he always comes out looking better as a person, generally. Because he's, at his core, a good person. We get the funeral of Qui-Gon Jinn, where Obi-Wan promises to train Anakin. Palpatine's already promised that he's going to screw over Anakin. You have Mace and Yoda brooding at the funeral, wondering which was slain, the master or the apprentice. And they pray that it's the master. But unfortunately, they got the apprentice, which means the master is still running around. And Palpatine begins to search for a new apprentice, who will turn out to be Dooku next movie. So, let's rate this movie. Now, we tend to rate things on our other channels from a 0 to 4. Rating 0 being there's nothing salvageable, it's beyond the pall. 4 being it's perfect. Like what Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel would do on their show back in the day. So, you rate this movie.
I will say good solid 3.5.
I'm going to say you're being too hard on this movie, and I'm going to say it's a 4. I can't even think of a single thing to improve about this movie. I like every character. I may complain about Padme being dumb, but I actually like her as a character. I really like her character. Because there's a lot to be learned here. And Lucas is giving such a great civics lesson in this film about how young politicians sometimes just listen to older, more manipulative ones. And then younger politicians become those corrupted older politicians. That's kind of what's happening here with Anakin and Padme. And you have some who are giving sound advice, such as Qui-Gon or the Jedi, and they're not heeded. So ultimately, this is a very fascinating civic lesson in terms of the plot. It's a perfect movie. The action's perfect. The music's perfect. The characterization is perfect. The dialogue is... Now, you have to understand, the dialogue is perfect because it's on... Lucas is operating with an opera. You're supposed to look at this like John Milius's Conan the Barbarian movie, or like one of the old operas by Beethoven or Mozart. You're not supposed to think about this in terms, or even theater with Shakespeare. But you're not supposed to think about this in terms of, look at that cool one-liner. Honestly, this movie is superior to any recent movie because it doesn't use one-liners. It is using pure operatic speech, which I want that higher form of speech.
There's a reason why the Star Wars movies were adapted in Shakespearean play format.
Yeah, obviously they have a closer correlation to those stories than they do to a lot of modern stories. Although that said, Lucas is basically the sci-fi equivalent of J.R.R. Tolkien. He's invented so much of his world, so many cultures, so much stuff, so many political systems and structures and whatnot, that he's the closest thing we got to Tolkien since Tolkien's death. Honestly, the Star Wars prequels are my second favorite movie of all times, and I do say movie because it's supposed to be... All 6 movies are meant to be viewed as one movie. So actually, I'll say this is my favorite movie. Second to the Merlin movie.
The prequel,
from 1998.
The prequels are very underrated.
Yep. So I think we said all we had to say. Next time we'll be continuing with our graphic novel review of the Tales of the Jedi. And then what we'll do after that, who knows? But stay tuned for that. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to smash that like and that subscribe button as though you were Obi-Wan chopping Maul in half. And if you didn't, don't forget to smash that like and that subscribe button as though you were Obi-Wan smashing Maul in half.